Like Pete said, my name is Vanessa Corriher-Olson. I am a forage extension specialist. I am stationed out of the Overton Research and Extension Center in East Texas. If you're not familiar with Overton, it is not far from Tyler nor Longview in East Texas. So I'm maybe in a very different environment than where you guys are individually located, but a lot of the information I'm going to share today can span across a good part of our state. So today I'm going to talk about understanding introduced pasture fertilization. Get my slide working. So when we talk about introduced forages, that refers to forages, grasses specifically, that have been introduced into our state or into the United States. And some of those that are commonly used throughout Texas can include Bermuda grass as well as Bahia grass. Today I'm going to focus primarily on Bermuda grass. I will mention Bahia grass occasionally, but most of our pasture fertilization that I'm going to focus on today will be for Bermuda grass production. Depending on your environment, your soil type, as well as your average annual rainfall may or may not or will influence whether or not you are actually able to utilize Bermuda grass as a forage, whether for pasture or for grazing. This is actually a picture of coastal Bermuda grass that was located down in southeast Texas, in the kind of Beaumont area. So we do utilize quite a bit of Bermuda grass throughout our state. Primarily, a good part of it is going to be along the I-35 corridor or east, where we do tend to have higher average annual rainfall because, of course, rainfall is critical for forage production. So we're going to go and get started in talking about fertilization, and the most important aspect of pasture or hay meadow fertilization is soil testing. This is the number one thing that we need to put in our toolbox, is the use of soil testing in order to know exactly what nutrients are available for our forages, as well as what we might need to apply in order to improve forage production as well as persistence of those forage species. And oftentimes our introduced forages can have different fertilizer requirements as opposed to some of our native forages that we're utilizing in our state. So soil testing gives us information that allows us to take into account any nutrients that we are carrying over from year to year, season to season, and from prior fertilizer applications. So without soil testing, we're basically guessing in regards to what nutrients and the volume of nutrients we're applying to our property. So my recommendations, if you have a hay meadow, such as coastal or Tipton 85 Bermuda grass hay, you're harvesting on a regular basis every year, multiple harvests, I do recommend collecting soil samples every year. And that is because as you are removing those bales of hay from your property, you are removing a good portion of those nutrients within that bale of hay. So you are changing the nutrient status of your soil quite much more frequently as opposed to a grazing situation. So what my recommendation is for a grazing pasture, I typically recommend every 2 to 3 years, depending on production that's needed, or if there's any other extenuating circumstances, if you end up with a disease issue, or if you're looking to introduce other forage species onto your property, then you may want to perform a soil analysis prior to a pre-scheduled timing. So for hay meadow, every year, a grazing situation every 2 to 3 years. If you are acquiring new property, one of the first things I recommend is a soil analysis to determine, before you start making forage changes or vegetation changes, determine what might be needed in regards to nutrients prior to making those changes. So how do we collect samples? A lot of people unfortunately think you can just go out into the field and grab a handful of soil and call it good. We need to collect enough samples and a diversity of samples so that we have a good composite representation of that entire field, whether it's a hay meadow or a pasture, because we are going to fertilize that entire field the same. We're not going to be fertilizing that field based on a sample from one location. So we want a good representation of that entire area. We tend to refer to a pasture or hay meadow as a management area, and I typically recommend sampling management areas that we consider one management area about 40 to 50 acres. So if you have say a pasture that's 100 acres, then you would need to break that up into 2 management areas, even if you're going to fertilize them fairly similarly, to collect your samples from. So I recommend 10 to 20 cores per management area. So if you had 100 acres, you would collect 10 to 20 cores from half of that field, and then another 10 to 20 cores from the other half of the field. Once you've collected those cores, you mix those into a clean plastic bucket, and then then you would pull your sample from that bucket that you've collected, and you could add that to your soil sample bag that you can collect from your county extension office. They can also provide you with the paperwork as well as the directions on collecting those samples. Now, there are a lot of different tools that we can use to collect soil samples. As you can see in these photographs, a soil probe is actually being utilized. You can purchase one from several different resources online as well to collect those samples. The cost of those tools can vary anywhere from $80 up to $200, kind of depending on whether you purchase the Pinto version or the Cadillac version. So keep that in mind. You can also use a sharpshooter or a shovel to collect those soil samples. We do need to make sure that our sample is at least 6 inches. We're collecting at least 6 inches of soil with each of those samples, and you would need to remove any vegetative material, root material as well. So you're primarily sending 6 inches of soil with each of those samples. You also need to make sure that you're getting a good representation of that entire field. You do want to avoid areas where potentially cattle or livestock are congregating, and an area that might be heavy in manure, or in areas or locations where the soil changes, or any other concerning or issue areas you may want to avoid, or may want to sample separately. If you have a field that has some areas or half of the field is not doing as well as the other half, I would recommend collecting samples from those separate locations and sending in 2 different samples so you can compare and see if there's any nutrient differences or things that you need to improve upon to improve that production of that less productive part of the field. Also pictured here is a smaller version of what a soil analysis will look like if you get a soil analysis from Texas A&M at College Station. It's where our soil, forage, and water lab is located. I failed to include there is an excellent website, and at the end of the presentation I will introduce you to my personal website, and you can find a link at that for the soil testing lab at College Station, where you can download forms for submittal as well as additional information about our lab in College Station. So this is a closer look at a soil analysis. So basically what a routine soil analysis will show you is your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It will also include some secondary nutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. It will also tell you your soil pH. So it will tell you how much of those nutrients is available based on the soil sample that you sent, as well as what the lab is recommending you should apply based on that soil analysis. So do keep in mind that you want to send a quality sample so that you get quality results back. So the lab cannot control necessarily the type of sample that you send, so make sure you're sending a good representation so you get the best information back. So you will notice at the bottom of that, let me use my pointer here, you will notice down here there will be some additional instructions at the bottom of your soil analysis in regards to splitting applications of nitrogen or recommendations on limestone in order to improve your soil pH. So there's a lot of information on the soil analysis that can help you make economical as well as efficient choices whenever it comes to applying fertilizer. So as we talk about our fertilization, we're going to focus today primarily on our primary nutrients. So hopefully you will notice that Pete has popped up a poll. So if you would gladly or hopefully you will be able to participate. The question is, how often should you collect soil samples for a hay meadow? Keep in mind this is a field that's in production for hay. So your choices are every year, every 3 years, every 5 years, or never. So far, Majority of you are correct, and we should collect soil samples from our hay meadow every year. Remember, we are removing those nutrients in those bales of hay, either selling them to our neighbors down the street, or we are feeding those to our livestock in another part of our property. So we're not recycling those nutrients. Whereas in a grazing situation, we are actually recycling those nutrients. Ruminants such as cattle only keep 10 to 30% of the nutrients they ingest. The other 70 to 90% of those nutrients are recycled back into our pastures through their feces and urine. So we're not making big changes in our fertility in a grazing situation as we are in a hay meadow. So if you're in hay production, highly recommend a soil analysis on an annual or every year basis. So when we look at the nutrients that are actually needed for forage production, we have our primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, secondary nutrients, as well as micronutrients. Now, a routine soil analysis will give you your primary and secondary nutrients. If you have other concerns, or if it has been predetermined with a forage specialist or your county extension agent that you need more information beyond a routine soil analysis, there are additional tests that can provide information on micronutrients and other soil factors. So, but today we're going to focus, because of time, we're going to focus on our primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. They are considered primary nutrients because they are needed in larger quantities compared to secondary or micronutrients. So as we look at how much of the volume of our nutrients is actually needed for coastal Bermuda grass production. Now keep in mind, coastal Bermuda grass is a hybrid variety of Bermuda grass, and that means it has to be established vegetatively. It was developed at the University of Georgia in Tifton, Georgia, to improve production and quality of Bermuda grass that we can grow throughout the southeastern part of the United States. It is the oldest hybrid variety of Bermuda grass. It was released in 1943. Since then, there have been other varieties that have been released. One of the most recent that a lot of us are familiar with in Texas is Tifton 85. Is also a hybrid variety, and it was released in 1993, so almost 50 years past the release of coastal. So if you look at this table, you are going to see our primary nutrients in the top 3 rows: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You will also see pounds per ton in the 3rd column and pounds per 2 ton in the 4th column. So to produce 1 ton of coastal Bermuda grass, we need 50 pounds of actual nitrogen, 14 pounds of phosphorus, and 42 pounds of potassium. So as you can see, as we expect a higher yield out of that coastal Bermuda grass, it will require more inputs, more nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So if you can kind of remember those numbers in the back of your head as we continue our discussion, 50, 14, and 42, I'll kind of revisit that. As you can see, our secondary and micronutrients are not needed, or are important for forage production, but not nearly at the volume that our primary nutrients are needed. So we're going to go ahead and talk about each of the individual primary nutrients, why they are important, as well as some sources of those nutrients that are commonly used in agriculture. And towards the end of the presentation, we'll talk about some alternatives for some of these nutrients. So nitrogen, most of us understand the importance of nitrogen for grass or for forage production. Nitrogen is important for yield, as well as to produce a quality grass, a quality product. So nitrogen has a direct impact on yield, as well as the crude protein, which is a measure of nitrogen within our forages. So in this table, we're looking at the annual nitrogen in pounds per acre in the left column, and how that influences our yield in tons per acre, as well as our percent crude protein. So we have our annual nitrogen in pounds per acre. So this was applied within a year, so over time, not an application made at one time. So we have 0, 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 200, and then 400. 400 is fairly high. Most of us are not going to be applying that much nitrogen to our warm season perennial forages such as Bermuda grass through a season. And then yield, as well as crude protein. So as you can see, as we increase our nitrogen application, the rate of nitrogen we're applying, we are increasing our yield as well as we are increasing our crude protein content. So for most of us, yield can be important in regards to making sure we have sufficient forage available to meet the needs of our livestock, as well as the quality of that forage is going to be critical to meet the needs as well. Most of us, when we talk about nutritive value of forages, we reference crude protein quite often. So nitrogen has a direct impact on that crude protein value. Just to give you an idea, a dry mature cow, her crude protein requirement is 9%. So if we don't apply any nitrogen at all, we're not producing a quality product that can even meet our lowest productive animal on our property. So if you have cows with calves, if you have growing animals, whether it's replacement heifers or stockers, or any other livestock species that are highly productive, maybe horses that you're using for work or for pleasure that are very active, they're going to have a high nutrient requirement. And so by not applying nitrogen, you may not be providing the nutrients that they need for growth and production and maintenance. So you may have to expend additional resources on additional protein sources or even energy sources. So even if we may be saving money by not applying fertilizer, oftentimes our bill and other aspects of our production systems may increase, such as having to purchase feed or as well as having to purchase additional herbicide. So when we look at our fertilizer sources, anhydrous ammonia is a common nitrogen fertilizer source. Under normal conditions, it is a gas and then a liquid under high pressure and low temperatures. We are not commonly using anhydrous ammonia in forage systems such as pasture or hay meadow. Anhydrous ammonia has to be injected into the soil to minimize loss of that nitrogen into the environment. So that is probably more commonly utilized in cropping systems or with crops. And obviously, because of the fact it is highly volatile and highly explosive, it's not readily accessible to a lot of us or in a lot of areas. But most of our nitrogen fertilizer sources are actually made from anhydrous ammonia. So they start as anhydrous ammonia and then converted into another user-friendly type product. For example, urea, probably a very common nitrogen source utilized by forage producers, whether pasture or hay production, because it is a dry product. It is easily applied using a buggy. It's very water soluble and easily accessible to plant and available for the plant at application. Now, unfortunately, as everything has pros and cons, urea, unfortunately, is very volatile. So that means, as we talk about nitrogen, nitrogen itself is a very mobile nutrient. So that means that it moves within our environment, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes in some more detail. But nitrogen in urea is very volatile. That means it can escape into our atmosphere. So it's very important that we follow best management practices for the application of urea. I tend to recommend to my producers, especially in East Texas, I tend to recommend the use of urea during the spring as well as during the fall as our nitrogen source, when we tend to have more consistent rainfall or more consistent soil moisture, as opposed to the middle of the summer when we get very hot, very dry, as well as we can have high humidity. Those are factors that can influence the volatility of that urea product or the loss of that nitrogen into our environment. So we want to make sure that we're making applications appropriately to get utilization of that nitrogen and get our money's worth. Another common source of nitrogen is ammonium nitrate. It's 34% nitrogen. It is also a dry product, so it can be mixed with other fertilizer sources, other nutrients such as phosphorus or potassium. It is not nearly as volatile as urea. So for my producers in East Texas, for the middle of the summer with high heat and drier conditions, I recommend the use of ammonium nitrate as their nitrogen source. So best for mid to late summer applications. Other sources will include ammonium sulfate. So we have not only nitrogen within the ammonium sulfate, we also have some sulfur. So if your soil analysis recommends a sulfur application, this may be an option for you to include that additional sulfur. We do need to keep in mind that sulfur is very acidifying, so depending on your soil type as well as your soil pH, ammonium sulfate may not necessarily be the best choice for you, and we'll talk about that as we talk about soil pH later. UAN stands for urea ammonium nitrate. It is a solution. It is a liquid product, and it is composed of half urea and half ammonium nitrate. So it's great that part of that is ammonium nitrate, but because half of that is urea, it is subject to volatilization. UAN is often utilized with liquid mixtures when applying pesticides, whether it's herbicides or insecticides. But do have to be mindful of weather conditions and the potential for volatilization, as well as, since it is a liquid product and you're spraying it onto the foliage, it is subject to burning that foliage. So you may see a fertilizer burn, especially if we have warm weather. So more common to see occur during the heat of the summer. So this is a slide showing us the nitrogen cycle, and I wanted to point this out primarily because of the mobility of nitrogen, the fact that we can lose nitrogen in our atmosphere to volatilization, like I mentioned previously. So it escapes into our environment as a gas. Or we can also lose nitrogen to denitrification. That means that bacteria within our soil break down the nitrate nitrogen, removing the oxygen, and then releasing the nitrogen gas into the environment. So those are two ways that we're losing that nitrogen away from plant uptake. The third way is leaching. Leaching is more common in our very sandy soils as opposed to our heavier clay soils. And I think it was last year in East Texas, where we have a lot of sandy soils, there were a couple of times at the beginning of our season, our Bermuda grass season, where we had some torrential downpours, so where we got a high volume of rain very quickly. Unfortunately, that happened fairly quickly after a lot of my producers had applied nitrogen or as well as other fertilizer, and they potentially lost a lot of that nitrogen to that nitrogen moving deeper into the soil profile and away from that root structure of that plant. So those are ways that we can unfortunately lose nitrogen. So that's not to mean that we need to be afraid that we're going to lose our nitrogen every time we apply it. We just need to be more mindful of our methods and timing of application. So I always recommend, and you will see on your soil analysis, the same recommendation to split your nitrogen application. So I tend to only recommend applying 50 to 60 pounds of actual nitrogen at a time. Definitely no more than 100 pounds. You could go a little bit over that 60, but by splitting that nitrogen application, applying nitrogen between hay cuttings and throughout the season can increase our yields as well as increase our nutrient use efficiency. So the accessibility of that nutrient, nitrogen, to the root structure and reducing the potential loss. And this is especially true under extreme conditions. If there's a risk for leaching, if there's maybe a storm coming in, or a potential for high volume of rainfall at a given time, as well as a late freeze or a drought, that can also lead to some loss of those nutrients and decrease the utilization of those nutrients. I do recommend to producers it is best to apply nitrogen to a dry surface and then wait for rainfall, as opposed to waiting for rainfall and then applying nitrogen to a wet surface. If we think about our state, it's very hot in Texas and throughout the southeast in the middle of the summer. If we have moisture within our soil and at the soil level, we can have quite a bit of humidity, and humidity will increase the loss or the volatilization of nitrogen. Anything that slows forage production, such as drought conditions, that plant will not be readily taking up any nutrients until there is moisture available. So in conditions as such as much of our state is right now, with a lot of dry or drought conditions, it is best to put off applying nitrogen until you have a good chance of rainfall within the next couple of days. So paying attention to the weather forecasters in your area and watching those radars can help make more timely applications of nitrogen. All right, so our second primary nutrient is phosphorus. Remember, to produce a ton of Bermuda grass, we need 14 pounds of phosphorus. So not nearly as much phosphorus, obviously, as we need nitrogen. But phosphorus is still important to plant growth and production. If you are looking to reestablish, maybe you're converting, say, a Bahia grass field to Bermuda grass, or maybe even if you decided to convert a Bermuda grass field into a native forage environment, then still, anytime we're looking to make changes, I recommend a soil analysis, and for multiple reasons, but one critical reason is that we need to know what our phosphorus levels are, because if we're looking to establish seedlings, phosphorus is critical for early growth and early root formation. So anytime we're establishing forages of any kind, whether it's a grass or a legume, obviously root formation is going to be critical for other nutrient uptake as well as water uptake and persistence of that forage for that season or for multiple seasons. So phosphorus is critical for early growth and root formation, and that obviously means that it improves moisture and nutrient uptake. So luckily enough, phosphorus is not very mobile, so we're not at risk of losing that phosphorus like we are at risk oftentimes of losing nitrogen. So it will not leach, nor will it escape into the atmosphere, but it is subject to stratification, meaning that it can build up in the top 2 to 3 inches of our soil. So that can become a problem in regards to our environment, especially our water resources. If we have a lot of phosphorus built up into the top 2 to 3 inches of our soil, and then we have some soil erosion, that can lead to a runoff of that nutrient into bodies of water that can be detrimental to other plant life as well as animal life within that water resource. So we do need to be mindful of our utilization of phosphorus, and we'll talk about that in regards to animal manures as an alternative. So some of our phosphorus fertilizer sources will include diammonium phosphate. So we do have some nitrogen in that product. It is a dry product that's easily blended with other sources, and it's 46% phosphorus. Monoammonium phosphate is 48% phosphorus, and it also has some additional calcium. And then tri-superphosphate is 46% phosphorus with a little bit of sulfur as well as some additional calcium. So those are all dry products, granular products that can be blended with urea or ammonium nitrate to produce a blended product. So potassium, our third primary nutrient, this is one that I sometimes get on a soapbox in regards to Bermuda grass. So if we think back to those three numbers, we need 50 pounds of nitrogen, 14 pounds of phosphorus, and we need 42 pounds of potassium. Oftentimes, we tend to focus our fertilizer applications on nitrogen because we see a direct impact of nitrogen. And so in my time here in Texas as a forage specialist, I have seen a lot of Bermuda grass decline as well as some disease issues with Bermuda grass, and they have primarily been because of potassium deficiencies, because producers have failed to understand the importance of potassium for Bermuda grass production and persistence, and unfortunately have seen a loss of their stands and production because of not applying potassium when it was needed. So potassium is important for disease resistance. It also improves cold hardiness. So depending on your location, that could become a factor, as well as depending on our winters, which vary from year to year. We can have extreme winters and freezes at unpredictable times. And so maintaining that potassium can be important. Now, potassium typically is most often deficient in our sandier soils. So for me in East Texas, I see deficiencies much more commonly where I have a lot of sand. In our heavier soils, our blackland clays, or our more clay-based soils throughout the state tend not to have deficiencies in potassium, but it is still critical that we are doing a soil analysis to determine if that is in fact the case. So keep that in mind as you complete your soil analysis. Make sure you are looking at all three of those primary nutrients to make sure you're preventing any deficiencies that can lead to a reduction in productivity as well as a reduction in your stand. So this is a great visual And like I said, I like to say potassium is for persistence. So this is on some Bermuda grass in Overton, Texas, where plots were treated with different fertilizer rates and applications. You will see on the left here, um, there was 200 pounds of nitrogen, 40 pounds of phosphorus, and 160 pounds of potassium was applied. And then on the far right, this plot only had 200 pounds of nitrogen, 40 pounds of phosphorus, and no potassium. So you can see a great visual difference in those plots with the deficiency of potassium. Not only do you see some sorrel, an undesired plant, a weed basically, as you look through that vegetation, you may also see some bare ground where the Bermuda grass is actually starting to thin because, once again, potassium is for persistence. So our fertilizer decisions can impact the longevity of our stands, as well as it can impact our weed pressure. So keep in mind, weeds, undesirable vegetation tend to thrive in more stressful situations, lower soil fertility than our desired forages. So those fertilizer choices can influence the amount of herbicide we have to use as well. So our only source of potassium is potassium chloride, or muriate of potash. It is often called potash. It is 60% potassium. It is also a dry product that's easily blended with some of our other dry products that we previously mentioned. So that's our only source of potassium. So as I like to say, balanced nutrition is going to be important for forage production, especially for our introduced forages such as Bermuda grass. Bahia grass can persist on lower soil fertility, but soil fertility is still going to have an impact on the persistence as well as the productivity of Bahia grass. So without a soil analysis, we really do not know how much or what needs to be applied to our property. So this shows us how reducing the nutrients or only applying a select few nutrients can impact our Bermuda grass production. So on the left, they left out nitrogen. If you notice in color, that grass is much more yellow in color as opposed to a true emerald green. Obviously do not have the yield as if we had applied all of the nutrients, all of our primary nutrients. And then on the far right, simply leaving out potassium is going to not only impact the persistence, but as you can see, it's impacted the quantity, the yield of that forage, which often we find very critical for our forage production systems, whether it's a pasture or a hay meadow. So keep in mind, balanced nutrition, not only is it important for us as humans, but it's also important for our forage production. All right, so our next poll question, our second question, which nutrient deficiency is responsible for Bermuda grass decline? Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or sulfur? I'll give you guys a few minutes or a few seconds to select. I think just about everyone has voted. Of course, all of our nutrients are important, but potassium is the primary nutrient most often responsible for Bermuda grass decline. So a good majority of you are correct. Thank you for participating. We appreciate that. Make sure everybody's still with us. So another part of soil fertility that is important for introduced forage production is our soil pH. This table shows us basically a general impact of our soil pH on the left-hand side, the first column, how our soil pH influences our ability of our plants to utilize or take up nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium or potash. So the blue line here indicates a soil pH of 5.8, and according to our soil lab, that is listed as the critical level for our soil pH. So if your soil pH is below 5.8, they will make lime recommendations in order to improve your soil pH. As we drop below that 5.8, you will notice the percentage of that nutrient that is recovered declines substantially. So at 5.5, about 50% of the nitrogen can be utilized, 15% of the phosphorus, and then almost 45% of that potash can be utilized. So it's very important that we maintain our soil pH at the appropriate level for the forage species that we are growing. Bermuda grass, I tend to recommend maintaining a soil pH of at least 5.8. Some of our varieties are a little bit more tolerant of a lower soil pH than others. Tifton 85 Bermuda grass is the most sensitive to our soil pH. Some of our other forage species, such as Bahia grass, is more tolerant of acidic soils or a soil pH that is below 7 or a lower soil pH as compared to Bermuda grass. A lot of our cool season forages that we might be utilizing, ryegrass, small grains, as well as our legumes, can also be sensitive to soil pH. Most of our legumes prefer a soil pH of at least 6. So as you are looking to introduce forage species to your property, make sure you understand their preference for soil type as well as soil pH, and make sure that you make the appropriate adjustments so that you can have success with that forage species. So I mentioned earlier that ammonium sulfate was more acidifying or could acidify our soils. So this is some research from Overton showing the impact of our nitrogen sources, ammonium sulfate and ammonium nitrate, on our soil pH. So if we compare it to the plots where no nitrogen was applied, you can see our soil pH was measured at almost 6.5 or maybe around 6.3 as our soil pH, and we have very sandy soils here in Overton. So they do tend to be acidic, but at this point, this is a 3-year average, it was sitting around 6.3. With the addition of ammonium nitrate, we did see a slight drop in our soil pH, but we're still fairly close to that 6. However, ammonium sulfate is 3 times as acidifying as ammonium nitrate, and our soil pH was dropped well below 5. So if you're using ammonium sulfate as your nitrogen source, do keep that in mind. For every pound of ammonium sulfate you apply, you would need to apply 5 pounds of 100% ECCE lime in order to counter that acidifying effect, basically to bring your soil pH back up to where it was prior to applying that ammonium sulfate. So be mindful of your nitrogen sources and how they can influence or impact your soil pH. All right, our third question, nutrient use efficiency is best at what soil pH? A 3.0, 4.0, 5.0, or 6? Keep in mind 7 is neutral, and the lower that number is, the more acidic. So the correct answer is 6. 5 is pretty close, but 6 would be a lot better. So thank you for participating. Just keep in mind, make sure you are paying attention to your soil pH on your soil analysis. Your soil type can greatly influence the potential for your soil pH. Our sandier soils, like I mentioned, do tend to be more acidic or having a lower soil pH than our soils, a lot of our soils that have clay in them. So some alternative sources of nutrients. One of those, or some common alternatives, are animal manures. Depending on where you're located in the state and what other agricultural production systems are in your area, you may be lucky enough to be close to some poultry litter. It's very common in east and central part of the state. There are a lot of poultry houses, and more farms are going up or have gone up in the past couple of years and continue to do so. So this table is to illustrate the variability in our animal manures. So we have our sources on the left-hand column, and then the pounds per ton of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So when we'll look at broiler litter, which is very common in Central and East Texas. There are, several numbers here. The number outside the parentheses is the average. So on average, there are 58 pounds of nitrogen per ton of broiler litter. The number within the parentheses, however, is the range, so it can vary greatly, anywhere from 34 to 89 pounds of nitrogen per ton of broiler litter. So animal manures, whether it's manure from a dairy or poultry litter, is highly variable. Luckily enough, our soil testing lab will also analyze manure for you. You may send a sample to the lab. There are instructions on their website. You may send a sample and they will tell you exactly how many pounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are in that ton of product that you have purchased or that you may have already applied. So do keep in mind they are highly variable. Poultry litter, our nitrogen is in various sources within that poultry litter. So not all of the nitrogen is plant accessible at time of application. So I do recommend top dressing with an additional nitrogen source so that at the beginning of the season you have more nitrogen available at that beginning point to initiate growth at the beginning of the season. So it'll be somewhat of a slow release of those nutrients throughout that season, as well as you'll see some additional benefits the following year. Now, as we look at poultry litter, you'll see poultry litter is very high in phosphorus compared to some of our other sources. If you compare to dairy or even to beef manure, phosphorus is fairly high. So I do recommend, if you're utilizing poultry litter on a regular basis, to continue with your soil analysis to monitor your phosphorus levels. If you have any soil erosion and if you have high phosphorus in your soils, you could potentially have some negative impact on your water resources. So we want to be good stewards of our natural resources. So please be mindful of your phosphorus levels, because Bermuda grass, remember, to produce 1 ton of coastal Bermuda grass, you only need 14 pounds of phosphorus. So you can end up applying a lot more phosphorus than is actually needed for Bermuda grass production. So there are also a lot of other alternatives, or what I refer to as non-traditional products. We tend to see more of these products on the market with interest in natural production or organic production, as well as when fertilizer prices are high. Oftentimes we see a lot of these non-traditional products come out on the market. So just a few recommendations in regards to those. This is some research from the University of Arkansas comparing traditional fertilizers such as ammonium nitrate, urea, and urea ammonium nitrate to some non-traditional products such as fish emulsion, Monty's plant food, and a C90 mineral. And this was on Bermuda grass in Arkansas. We have our treatments on the left, and then on the right, our dry matter yield in pounds per acre. So pounds of Bermuda grass that were produced per acre. And I have ranked them from the most productive all the way down to the least Bermuda grass produced. Untreated check basically means that no nutrients of any source were applied to that plot. And statistically speaking, when we compare the untreated check to these 3 orange highlighted non-traditional products, there was no statistical difference between their production. So doing nothing produced about as much Bermuda grass as applying some of these non-traditional products. Oftentimes these non-traditional products are not even applying any nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium. They may claim that they're applying microorganisms or bacteria that increase nutrient uptake. So make sure you read the information on these products and what's actually in these products to determine if there is actually any nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium. And remember that 50-14-42 to produce that ton of Bermuda grass. If there are any nutrients, they tend to be in very minimal quantities, and you would have to apply a high rate of those products to equate to get anywhere close to what our other nutrient sources can actually supply in a smaller volume. So do keep that in mind. If you come across a non-traditional product that you're not familiar with, feel free to ask your county extension agent. I will provide my contact information here shortly, so you can reach me if you have any specific questions as well. Speaking of, I noticed we have a question in the chat. I will go ahead and address that very, very quickly. The question is, what is the nutrient value of goat manure? I unfortunately do not know that off the top of my head. It will provide some nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. If you would like that specific breakdown, I'll be happy to get that information for you. Like I mentioned, I will share my contact information towards the end, and you're welcome to reach out to me with that particular question, and I can find that information for you. But unfortunately, I don't know that off the top of my head. Another common question is also the value of horse manure, and I'll be happy to provide that for anyone who has interest. Do keep in mind if you're using animal manures, especially around a garden or an area where you intend to grow broadleaf plants or want to keep broadleaf plants, do be mindful of the hay source that they are consuming if you're feeding them hay, and know the herbicides that have been previously applied to that grass that's in that hay, because it is potential to pass on through the manure some of our active ingredients and our herbicides that prevent broadleaf plants or kill broadleaf plants. So if you're using animal manures such as horse manure, goat manure around or in fields where you intend to grow broadleaf plants, be mindful of those herbicides or ask those questions of your hay source. So some other questions that have come up. Timing of rainfall can be tricky. How long on average will dry fertilizer remain viable if the rain does not come the day after applied? A good majority of that nitrogen will sit there on the surface. You may lose some depending on weather conditions. You may lose 5 to 10%, up to 20% of that nitrogen, but a good majority of it will stay on the ground and kind of wait for rainfall. But it is best to apply that nitrogen fertilizer prior to a very high chance for rainfall. I do realize that our weather forecasters, depending on where you are in the area, I know a lot of times we've gotten predictions, you know, a 60% chance of rainfall, and then we get nothing. But then there's days where it's a 10% chance and we get rainfall. So it is very tricky. You have to, you know, do your best, but you'll have, if you apply it to a dry surface, you will have minimal loss. All right, so Robert mentioned he's requesting more information on the value of goat manure. So like I said, I'll show you how you can reach me, and I'll be happy to find or locate that information for you. So just some overall management recommendations as we wrap up here today. Of course, as always, one of my biggest soapboxes is soil testing. Soil testing is the cheapest thing that you can do in regards to your fertility management. A routine soil analysis at College Station will cost you about $10 to $12. So very minimal expense that can potentially save you a lot of money. So remember, every year for a hay meadow, every 2 to 3 years in a grazing or a pasture situation. If you do have acidic soils or a soil pH issue, do not cut back on lime applications. Lime can improve your soil pH and therefore improve the nutrient uptake of any nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that you apply. If you do need to make economical decisions, focus your resources. So your most productive hay meadow or the pasture that is in the best condition, you may focus your resources, your fertilizer on those locations where the fields that are already very productive and can maintain production through a given season. Use animal manures when available, but be strategic, especially with products that are very high in phosphorus. If you have forages such as Bermuda grass that do not need excessive amounts of phosphorus. Make sure you're splitting your nitrogen applications. I typically only recommend applying 50 to 60 pounds of nitrogen at a time to minimize some of that loss, whether it's to volatilization, denitrification, or leaching. And make sure you maintain good potassium levels, especially for Bermuda grass. One thing I did fail to mention, and I do want to mention in regards to Bermuda grass and potassium, Bermuda grass can be a luxury consumer of potassium, so I also recommend splitting your potassium applications, especially if your soil analysis calls for more than 70 pounds of potash or potassium per acre. So if you have a very high recommendation, say over 100 pounds of potassium is needed for that Bermuda grass pasture or hay meadow, I recommend splitting that application, and you'll see the same recommendation on your soil analysis, because Bermuda grass will use more potassium at a given time if it is available than it actually needs. So by splitting that potassium, we make sure that we have potassium accessible to that forage throughout the entire season, so you don't see an impact of potassium deficiency even though you have applied potassium. There are a lot of good alternatives such as animal manures, but be mindful of other alternatives. I tend to say if something sounds too good to be true, then more than likely it is. So if you come across some alternatives and you want to know what it can actually supply your forages or if it is a valuable alternative, please ask more questions of those of us in Extension. We'll be happy to help. All right, so going back to some questions, Dennis Reed asked, how early in the spring should we begin fertilizing? I've been told by quote-unquote old-timers to wait until late May or early June. That is an excellent question on timing. So when we're applying nitrogen, we're going to talk about each of those nutrients kind of independently. So nitrogen, we should only apply nitrogen when we have actively growing forage. So for Bermuda grass, for example, Bermuda grass can break dormancy fairly early for us in East Texas. Some of our Bermuda grass had broken dormancy in March even. However, because our night temperatures were still below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, we still had nights in the 40s and 50s. Now, we didn't have another freeze, but as long as our night temperatures are below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, Bermuda grass is not actively growing. It may be green because it's broken dormancy, but it is not actively growing. I recommend waiting until our Bermuda grass is actively growing before we apply any nitrogen. If we apply nitrogen prior to that event, prior to Bermuda grass actively growing, other undesired vegetation, whether it's volunteer ryegrass or weeds, are going to utilize that nitrogen as opposed to that Bermuda grass because it's not actively growing. So a lot of my producers, unfortunately, in East Texas applied fertilizer back in March. Many of them did, and even April. And for us in the East Texas, our Bermuda grass did not actively start growing until May. So it's going to vary from year to year depending on our temperatures. So pay attention to those night temperatures because Bermuda grass doesn't start growing until our soil temperatures are 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is not going to occur until we have multiple days of night temperatures in the 60s and for multiple consecutive days. Phosphorus and potassium can be applied basically at any time. A lot of producers will make fall or winter applications because neither of those nutrients are very mobile. Dormant Bermuda grass will pull some nutrients, but very, very little. So they will carry over from year to year. But for nitrogen, it's more critical that we have actively growing forage or Bermuda grass. All right, Howard asked, what about dew on the ground affecting nitrogen? That can potentially create a humid environment, but you will have some loss. What percentage, I do not know personally. I would say it's probably fairly minimal as opposed to if you were applying it to a wet surface. If you've applied it prior to a dew event, would probably have less volatilization. So it's very tricky. It's always a risk when it comes to applying nitrogen. We just have to do our best. I do know that obviously weather and environmental conditions are outside of our control, so we just have to do our best. So if you're looking for my contact information, this is my website, foragefacts.tamu.edu. If you click, I think if I remember correctly, if you click, once you get to this website, to the page, if you click on Forage Facts, this Forage Facts right here, it should take you to where you can find my contact information. This website you can also subscribe to by entering your email address, and anytime I post information, which I do try to maintain a weed of the week or post at least once to twice a week, you'll receive an email somewhat like a newsletter, but not nearly as detailed maybe as most newsletters, but it will provide you with that post that has been posted most recently. You do not necessarily have to subscribe, but it is a good way to get new information. There are other events, publications, And under the useful links, you will find the link for our soils lab at College Station, which that website is soiltesting.tamu.edu. If you want to jot that down, but you can locate it at the Forage Facts website as well. Feel free to give me a call or send me an email if you have additional questions. Anything in regards to forage production, I will be happy to respond. I can also, if you'd like, I'll type in my email address within the chat, so you can access it from there. And then the soil testing website I will put in there as well. So at the soil testing website, you can download their forms for soil analysis as well as forage analysis or even a manure analysis. So there's those links for you, but you can find those also at the Forage Facts website. I will be happy to answer any additional questions. Like I said, please feel free to reach out to me with any of your forage questions that you might have.